Hello everybody. We greet you in our Arabic greeting. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you. That's the Arabic greeting. We'd like to welcome you all for our lecture series of the ASU Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies. This is the Spring 2026 second lecture on the lecture series. And I would introduce Dr. Khalid. We welcome him very warmly from McGill University shortly. But before that, my name is Souad Ali. I am the founding chair of the ASU Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies. I'm head of Classics and Middle Eastern Studies and director of the Arabic Studies program, professor of Arabic Literature, Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies in the School of International Letters and Cultures in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So welcome you all very much indeed. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Khalid now. Dr. Khalid Mustafa Medani is Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies at McGill University in Canada, where he is also Chair of the African Studies Program and Director of the Institute of Islamic Studies. He has also taught at Oberlin University College and Stanford. Dr. Medani received a BA with honors in Development Studies from Brown University, an MA in Development Studies from the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, University of California, Berkeley. His research focuses on globalization and the political economy of Islamist and ethnic politics in Africa and the Middle East, with a special focus on Sudan, Egypt, and Somalia. Dr. Medani is the author of Black Markets and Militants in Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa, Cambridge University Press, that came out in 2021, which received an award from the American Political Science Association for the best book in the field of Middle Eastern and North African Studies, politics, by a senior scholar in 2022. The award was given in 2022. Dr. Khalid Medani's work has appeared in Political Science and Politics, the Journal of Democracy, the Journal of North African Studies, Current History, Middle East Report, Review of African Political Economy, Arab Studies Quarterly, and the UCLA Journal of Islamic Law. Dr. Khalid Medani is a previous recipient of a Carnegie Scholar on Islam Award from Carnegie Corporation of New York. I will now give you a brief introduction of the Council of Arabic Islamic Studies and then the title of the lecture of Dr. Khalid Medani. So our vision, reflecting on the rich diversity of both Arabic studies and Islamic studies, the interdisciplinary program of the ASU Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies, and the research in Arabic and Islamic studies in diverse regions such as in the Middle East, including the Arab world, Turkey, and Iran, as well as Islamic studies in regions beyond the Middle East and Africa, in countries such as Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and other Muslim majority countries as well. The program provides and promotes the teaching of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, as well as other languages taught in ASU's School of International Letters and Cultures, including Indonesian and Hindi Urdu, in collaboration with the study of sociology, history, politics, anthropology, and religion. Our mission is that the Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies was established at Arizona State University to acknowledge the significant contributions of Arabic studies and Islamic civilization and cultures to the world at large, both historically and in the modern age. The Council's research and teaching programs seek to promote multiculturalism, diversity, inclusive excellence, interfaith dialogue, cross-cultural understanding, and the expansion of human civilization and cultures through Arabic as well as other Middle Eastern languages, including Persian and Turkish, as noted. The Council seeks to develop constructive academic and cultural interaction and partnerships between ASU and similar groups in the Arab world and Muslim worlds. My own conviction has always been literature is often conceived as a cultural tool towards a greater human understanding. The more we study others' literary arts, cultures, and civilizations, the better enabled we become to achieve understanding and to work toward world peace. And at this point, I'm happy to give the floor to Dr. Khalid Medani, and the title of his speech today is Understanding the Local and Regional Dynamics of the War in Sudan, Evaluating the Obstacles and Prospects for Peace. Dr. Medani, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, uh, Professor Souad. First of all, I am deeply honored by this invitation. Thank you very much also for such a generous introduction of me. I think there's a little bit of bias because we're both from Sudan, so we should have full disclosure, Professor, about that.
I'm a Sudanese American, you're Sudanese Canadian.
That's right. Yes, a little
A
bit.
little distinction. Okay, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah.
Thank you.
These days, there's a distinction, I think. But we also
Yes.
share something else that I share with all of your colleagues, and that is that I'm very proud to be the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies, which is the largest and the oldest institute of its kind in Canada. And when you read out your mission and all of the services and teaching that you provide, that's really a replica of our Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University. We teach all of the languages you mentioned, Arabic, Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, and Urdu as well as Persian. And we're also interdisciplinary as well. We have professors who teach everything ranging from Islamic philosophy to literature and to even Sufi and Islamic law. And so I think that we share a great deal in that respect. Today, I'm going to put on my political science hat. Having said that our institute, like yours, is interdisciplinary, I want to be clear that today I'm going to return to my roots and my discipline, which is, of course, political science. And I titled my talk in consultation with you, Professor Ali, Understanding the Local and Regional Dynamics of the War in Sudan. And while we always talk about the roots of the war, I wanted to conclude by also talking about the prospects, not only the obstacles, but the prospects for resolution and for peace. And here's where I have to put on my Sudanese hat as well. And I know many of our friends in the region and throughout the world wish very much that this brutal war does come to an end. And so, with that preface, I wanted to start with a map of, I always do this to be very clear about the size of the country, but also the humanitarian consequences of the war. As many of you know, the war is now over 3 years. It began on April 15, 2023. And before I talk about the dynamics of the war and the prospects for its resolution and also the regional actors, I wanted to be very clear about the importance of the country in the region itself. This is a country, Sudan, that is, of course, that borders 7 countries. But I think lots of people who are not from the region or who are not at Arizona State University and your colleagues are not familiar with the importance of Sudan geopolitically for the region. And here is really a quick kind of look at its importance with respect to its relationship to the Arabian Gulf, of course, across the Red Sea, of course, its historic borders and relationship with Egypt as well as Libya, its relationship to its former kind of compatriot country, South Sudan, and of course, Ethiopia and Chad. And here you get really a quick look at the importance of the regional factor associated with Sudan's relationship to the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf, Egypt, but also the Sahel region, which is extremely important. But the map also shows, unfortunately, the devastation associated with the war. As many of you know, in a very short span of a little more than 3 years, Sudan has witnessed a displacement now of upwards of 14 million Sudanese in very quick and short amount of time. No Sudanese family has been kind of spared the consequences of this war. And it's very important before talking about the political dynamics to be very clear. In addition to that, as you'll see here, there have been hundreds of thousands who have been made refugees seemingly overnight, of the most in Egypt, but also in South Sudan and Ethiopia, and of course Chad from the western regions of the country. In addition to that, of course, there's the infrastructural destruction. It's very important to emphasize because numbers don't do it justice. The destruction of the civilian infrastructure, including the medical facilities and hospitals, the schools and the universities. And so the consequences of the war in human lives is immense, but also in terms of the civilian infrastructure and the kind of infrastructure of the country itself has been devastated in an unprecedented fashion. And so for those unfamiliar with Sudan, I always want to emphasize the humanitarian consequences of the war. But in terms of the military aspects of the war, I wanted also to show a map of what we are really witnessing at the moment. I will detail in more detail or specifics the warring parties and their visions for the Sudan and the causes of the war. But here, quickly, I wanted to just highlight that there are two warring military parties here. One is led by General Abdel Fattah Burhan and the Sudan Armed Forces, and the other, famously or infamously, the Rapid Support Forces militia, paramilitary militia, led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. And here, for those once again who are unfamiliar, you can quickly see what is ongoing. This map has changed a little bit, but in general, this is what is happening in Sudan on the military front. The dark orange here are the territories that are controlled by the military, the Sudan Armed Forces, and the lighter orange here that includes Darfur and now the Kordofan region, also a western region of Sudan, is effectively controlled by the Rapid Support Forces militia. Right now, the epicenter of the fighting is around the Blue Nile region that is bordering South Sudan, but also the area of Kordofan, particularly Western Kordofan, that is seeing epicenter of the fighting. And it's very important to understand that, as this map shows, that in a political science and geopolitical sense, or rather tactical sense, we have now what we call a stalemate militarily, with changes every day. But this is really what we're seeing. And I think it's important to begin with a very clear idea of the fact that the country is, in military terms, seemingly divided. But I also want, before I talk about the roots of the conflict, because I was cognizant of the fact that I will have probably listeners and viewers among your colleagues as well who are experts of the region, the Middle East region and the Arabian Gulf region. And right now, all that much of the attention is not so much on the Sudan war, although I think that obviously much more attention should be given to the war in Sudan, and this is why I'm so honored to be speaking about it. But there's a great deal of attention, understandably, throughout the world around the Iran and the U.S. conflict, and it's very important to emphasize right off, because I know that that's a question that comes up by many, to me at least, and that is what are the consequences of the war in Iran and the U.S. and Israel war on Iran? What consequences does that have for a country like Sudan? And I just wanted to quickly just highlight the fact that Sudan shares the Bab el-Mandeb Straits with Yemen, the Red Sea Straits that, of course, flow into the Indian Ocean. It's a very strategic waterway, just like the Strait of Hormuz, that basically carries approximately between 12 to 15% of the world's energy. And so its insecurity has already undermined the energy of and needs of the entire region, including Egypt and not only Sudan. But the Strait of Hormuz, that is much talked about, has also affected Sudan in a humanitarian sense. And here, very quickly, you'll see a chart of the kind of fertilizers that actually come from the Strait of Hormuz. Sudan is one of the largest recipients of those fertilizers. And for an agricultural country where so many people rely on on agriculture for self-subsistence and also to market those agricultural commodities, immediately you'll see not only a rise in prices in Sudan that is devastating to the Sudanese population, but as the harvest comes, and it has already begun in Sudan, the cost of fertilizers as a result of the war has devastated Sudan, and the human aspect, the humanitarian consequences are quite large. Now, this is not only Sudan, it affects the global south as well. So I wanted to be very clear about how this region, on how Sudan is deeply connected economically as well as historically to the region, including the Arab Gulf countries and Iran in this case, with respect to the Strait of Hormuz. Having said that, outline some of the basics, I wanted to talk about the roots of the conflict itself. And for all of us to be on the same page, I thought it may be clearer and easier for me to outline the argument that I'm going to make, just in case some of the facts become a little bit too detailed. I wanted to be clear about why what I believe is really the dynamics of the war in Sudan. First of all, I would argue that Sudan is really a contestation of authority between the armed forces and the rapid support forces over the struggle to build new states. This is, of course, very different from other civil wars that are really geared towards a military victory. And the reason Sudanese in general and others who know Sudan have been hesitant to call it a civil war is because there's an additional dynamic here. There is really kind of a conflict on the part of both warring parties to build a state anew. A state that would replicate or rather go beyond the post-colonial state that saw independence or witnessed independence in 1956. So one aspect and dynamic of the war that we can talk about, and I want to emphasize, is that it represents a new efforts through violent means of state building. You'll see it in the Sudan Armed Forces leadership's imposition or implementation of new currencies. You'll see it in the rhetoric of the Rapid Support Forces leader who talks about recreating a new Sudan, destroying the 1956 Sudan. That kind of contestation is a really important aspect of what the war is about. But another aspect of the war, and this is key, and I'll mention it perhaps in more detail, that it's a transnational and regional conflict of what I would call overlapping networks of political authority competing for military, political, and economic authority. So the role of resources in Sudan helps us understand the local dynamics, which is part of the title of this talk, but it also helps us understand what I would term the internationalization of the conflict in Sudan. Why is it that so many countries, regional countries, are involved and helping to sustain the conflict? One easy answer to highlight is the competition over the vast natural resources of Sudan. This is linked to another aspect, which I would call, kind of in summary, the kind of war economy that may not be at the very root of the war, but as Sudanese know full well, it really has led to sustaining this war over time. The non-state versus informal economy versus the informal illicit economy, which includes a number of different commodities, but very importantly, the very important commodity of gold that is playing such an important aspect in sustaining, fueling, and financing much of the arms, for example, of the Rapid Support Forces militia. So very quickly, I wanted to highlight that this war is about efforts at state building on behalf of both parties, competition over natural resources, and the struggle and control over markets. So what I wanted to do is, following that argument, is just quickly give you an outline of what I'm going to talk about in this lecture prior to the conclusion. Much of this detail is going to be necessarily short, or rather summarized, but definitely we can take, or I can take some question in the Q&A about some of the details. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the rise and fall of the previous regime of Omar Bashir. I want to highlight some of the key elements that are very, very important. But the most important aspect of highlighting that legacy of history of the former regime is to talk about the fact that the regime itself and Nizam itself has not fallen, but rather the leadership fell with the fall and ouster of Omar Bashir in April of 2019. So that's the first part I think it's important to understand. Without understanding the legacy of the authoritarian regime, we can't understand the roots and dynamics of the war. The second thing I want to do, and I'll try to do it briefly, although it's difficult, I've published on this extensively, but in this case, I'll abridge it a little bit, and that is to explain the success of the pro-democracy revolution, what we call in Sudan al-Thawra al-Majida, the glorious revolution of 2018, late 2018 and 2019. And the reason I want to talk about that is because it represents a model of popular mobilization for Sudan and for the region that was highly successful. It did, of course, falter and it was upended by the war, and even prior to that. But I also want to make an argument that both military actors are also fighting against the civilian population, and much of their motivation is against the pro-democracy revolution. Following that, I want to talk also briefly about the external and regional factor that I kind of prefaced at the beginning. Many people are talking about the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Egypt. It's very important to just try to parcel out very quickly the importance of the regional factor and what is it that these external actors, what vested interest do they have with respect to this war in Sudan, and why are they invested in it being sustained? Although I have to say that there are prospects for resolution that I'll discuss. In the context of that, I want to talk about the October 25th of 2021 military coup that really began the steps that led to the war itself. And then talk about why this war has developed in such brutal fashion with respect to the violence against civilians. I think for Sudanese and others, and certainly for those when I give talks to Sudanese audiences, one of the most important puzzles for all of us, understandably, is why is it that both parties are utilizing such violence against innocent civilians? And unfortunately, and here is political science can help us, there's a logic to this violence that I want to quickly talk about. Um, And finally, I want to conclude by talking very briefly about the prospects for peace, as I promised with respect to the title itself. So I want to talk about that first aspect of my argument first, and that is what I call the macro foundations of political violence. Here, I take inspiration from the political scientists, sociologists, and historians who talk about how war sometimes is a violent effort at making new states. And in the case of Sudan, what we see on the part of both parties, and this is something that I think is increasingly obvious, and that is the violent efforts at extracting resources to accumulate capital in a way to shape state building efforts. And it's very important to highlight that this is very much part and parcel of a period where the autocratic state of Umar Bashir built the edifice of the state. This kind of relationship between violence, accumulation of resources, often through violent and, of course, corrupt means, in order to build kind of strong states. And that becomes a really important aspect of understanding the violence. But another aspect in the case of understanding the kind of legacy of the former regime in Sudan is to understand the role of ideology. And the reason that that's important, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but to say that the particular kind of ideology that developed in Sudan under the leadership of Hassan Turabi, the Islamist stalwart at the time, and Umar Bashir, really did play a role in justifying displacement and expulsion. Defined increasingly in racial and ethnic rather than even religious terms, it becomes really an ideology just justifies the violence against the Darfurians in Sudan, particularly in the early 2000s, and that continues under the Rapid Support Forces as well. And then finally, it's very important to understand, or rather question, why the Rapid Support Forces in particular, for example, is utilizing such mass-scale violence. I visited Darfur in the first war in the early 2000s, and the question that Darfurians asked me the most was, why is it, ya Ustaz, why is it that there is such mass violence, such a severity of violence meted out against our communities? And it is something that for many years I've tried to also make sense of. And so I think it's important for us to understand that, because it has, unfortunately, also similarities to other forms of mass scale violence that we've witnessed and continue to witness in the region, not only in the Arab world, but also in Africa. And finally, I'll talk about the external actors. Prior to doing that, I wanted to talk about something perhaps a little bit more optimistic, because I did promise that I would talk about the prospects for peace. And I thought about how in our discussion and what I could leave you with respect of how to evaluate the prospect for peace, even in the midst of such brutal war. And here, it's very important to really learn from other civil wars and wars, in particularly in Africa and elsewhere, and those who for many years have been trying to figure out this kind of question of how civil wars end, or how wars end. The first order of business is to understand the environment of Sudan, and this is why I showed you the map. The geographic aspect of the country is a very important way to begin to evaluate prospects for peace, by highlighting what political scientists have famously called the spoilers to the conflict, the neighbors to the conflict, and the spoils, the resources of the conflict. The other aspect that helps us evaluate the prospect for peace is understanding the international incentive, or the incentive on the part of external actors with respect to the war in Sudan. That is the international commitment to negotiations. How strong is that? And that, of course, is directly tied to perceived national security interest. Why is that important? Very quickly, as many of you know, last September, you had the quartet, the United States, Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia begin this kind of effort at bringing the parties to the negotiation table. One of the reasons that occurred was because of that second item I highlight here, and that is the countries of the region have begun to understand that their own national security interests are being undermined. And so we see this also recently in Berlin, where many countries, including Egypt, the Arab League, the African Union, and other regional blocs, IGAD as well, also came together to restart these efforts. Just a couple of days ago, the representative of the American administration said once again he wants to begin to bring about steps towards negotiation. So understanding the international environment is important. Effective peace, therefore, requires number one, understanding the roots and the context of the war. That's very important. And developing a strategic mix of policies and coercion based on realistic expectations of the international community. And to evaluate the prospect for peace, or whether the negotiations under the United States or the negotiations that occurred beginning in Jeddah at the beginning of the war with the US and Saudi Arabia, the ones that are being brokered oftentimes, let's say, in Egypt, understanding these two elements helps us understand whether peace in Sudan is possible. And here it's very important to understand the environment for peace. The relative difficulty of a particular environment can prevent peace occurring. And here I just wanted to quickly tell you what I mean by spoilers, neighbors, and valuable spoils, because the rest of the lecture I'm going to highlight how that relates to the war in Sudan. And in order to do that, I want to emphasize, number one, that difficult environments, and of course the Sudan is a difficult environment, require more external resources for peaceful negotiations. And we have to evaluate and determine the commitment and prospects for intervention by the international community. This is the question everyone is asking. Will these talks in Berlin end up being useful? How about the efforts of the quartet? Will Saudi Arabia and the UAE come together to actually broker some kind of peace to end the war in Sudan? Understanding the role of spoilers, the neighbors, valuable spoils, helps us understand that. These, of course, are the figures of the major actors. Sudan is not peripheral to the region. It's very important to understand this. I'm always asked and told, and we're told that Sudan is a forgotten war. But in the Arab press, it's not. It's always headlined as a second or third most important story because these are very important players in the region who have vested interest and also have alliances with these two gentlemen, Abdel Fattah Burhan of the Sudan Armed Forces and Hemeti or Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo of the Rapid Support Forces. So, what does it take to have and implement effective peace agreements? If we find these negotiations continue, what would be the things that the items that we should look to see if there is in fact a prospect for peace? Number one, we have to look at the spoilers and analyze them. And the way to do that is to really look at how committed and well-resourced they are to create a negative environment. Weak, uncommitted spoilers do not drastically affect the implementation process. And as an example, both the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are very well-resourced countries. Their role in the Sudan war is a crucial one to help us understand whether an effective peace agreement could actually occur. The neighboring states, of course, it really depends, and I'm using these countries as an example to make it very clear whether the UAE, Saudi Arabia are highly committed, well-resourced, if they're unfriendly to the aspirations of the Sudanese people and for peace, obviously that makes it difficult. A few uncommitted and poorly resourced, unfriendly neighbors have little effect. And here is where the irony is. In other words, countries that actually do not have the kind of resources the UAE and Saudi Arabia may have actually would play less of an effective role if they were the only ones involved in negotiations. What that means is the countries that are the most well-resourced and have a commitment to peace potentially, and I say here potentially, could actually help in effective peace agreements. And finally, very importantly, are the spoils, the resources. Here in the Sudan case, we have a number of resources that are crucial. Gold becoming an important one. Sudan is the third largest exporter of gold in Africa, the 12th largest exporter of gold in the entire world, but it also has oil and diamonds and timber. This increases the likelihood of third-party war profiteering. Put very simply, the kind of economic incentives of the smuggling of gold from Sudan, let's say, through Chad and to the markets, the United Arab Emirates, that then becomes a difficult aspect of actually implementing a peace agreement if there's still a war economy, war profiteering that is going on. How to deal with that requires perhaps embargoes, regulation of these informal trades, and to try to stymie and limit the war economy that is providing incentives for the war. And here I want to talk more empirically, very quickly, about the different parties that I promised to do. And I've titled this The Struggle for Modern Sudan, and specifically the state of 1956. Dr. Souad will know, as all Sudanese know, that the rhetoric around the war on the part of both parties and Sudanese at large is that what is the future of the post-independent Sudan as a nation state with its territory and territorial integrity? What is the future? One of the questions often asked is that will it remain the way it did? After all, South Sudan seceded in 2011. And here we want to look very carefully at what I call what's at stake over the 1956 Sudanese state. And I want to show one slide that I hope will make it very clear. Number one, here is the kind of resources that are associated with the territorial control and fighting on the part of the Sudan Armed Forces leadership. Here you'll see it in red, and the Rapid Support Forces in yellow here, and parts in green as well, where you have what we call the Sudan other joint forces that are allied either with the Sudan Armed Forces or the Rapid Support Forces. But what's important to keep in mind here, in addition to the this geography is to understand that this maps also over, number one, of course, supply routes and the tactical strategic routes that are necessary for the military strategies of both parties, but also they also really reflect the conflict over resources in these parts of the country. And in order to understand not only the conflict in over resources, but the devastation over the capital of Sudan, it's very important to understand the political and economic reasons that the war looks like the war does in Sudan. When I said at the beginning, I want to explain the dynamics of the war in Sudan, it's number one, understanding the root causes, but also to understand why it looks different from other wars that occurred in Sudan. That is, why is it that it really began in the urban areas, and why that kind of violence occurred and has been occurring in the urban towns and not only the rural areas. One important aspect, and the best way to really explain that to you, is to talk about the political economy of Sudan very briefly. I am and have been for many years kind of specializing on the political economy of Sudan because I feel it really reflects our understanding of why these wars or this war looks the way that it does. Number one, it is an economy absolutely based and dependent on resource extraction. The bulk of the exports of Sudan no longer come from agricultural commodities as such, but from oil and other minerals. Number two, another very important dynamic of the Sudanese economy that helps us explain why you have rural and urban violence spread out through the country is to understand that there's always been a regional imbalance. And for those of you familiar to Sudan or have traveled to different parts of Sudan, as I have, and I always love to do that, what you will witness if you are an observant about the kind of economy of the rural areas is rural workers have historically been exploited to a very high degree. They are the ones who actually produce and mine these mines and other extractive industries, and they provide the bulk of the foreign currency earnings of the Sudanese national economy. For example, you have gold in Darfur, Kordofan, and the Ethiopian and Egyptian borders, livestock and forest goods from Darfur and Kordofan and the east, petroleum from the southern borderlands, that is the border with South Sudan. All of this is important, and Dr. Souad will know that gum arabic and simsim, sesame, is a very important export of Sudan. They come from the irrigated lands along the Nile and also from West
Indeed.
culture. Um, and so, what I want to emphasize here, and I think that many people don't really look at, and that is that rural Sudan has historically generated the overwhelming amount of exportable wealth. Imports also are heavily skewed towards urban consumption. I am someone from the urban areas of Sudan, from Khartoum and Durman, of course. This is not to blame individual communities in the urban areas, of course, but rather to say that historically, urban consumption has been privileged over rural workers and their economic livelihoods. Why is this important? It's important because it's important to understand why is it that so many rural men have been joining militias and have been kind of aggrieved enough to pick up arms. That's a really important aspect of this kind of imbalance. But it also reflects the root causes of the destruction of Khartoum and the urban areas, where the urban areas represent the important epicenter not only of consumption, but also of revenue kind of expenditure. And so that kind of dynamic becomes important. And finally, I'm not going to talk too much about this because I wrote a whole book on it. The illicit economy and the black market in Sudan has been the most important source of revenue generation for the successive regimes in Sudan, in particular the previous one. And that has, in addition to gold smuggling, has really made it very impossible to actually have peace in Sudan, and particularly because the state itself is really withering away because it is unable to capture formal revenue to build things like bureaucracies and to provide public goods for the majority of the Sudanese population. And very quickly, I wanted to highlight the legacy of the previous authoritarian regime. I want to talk about four things quickly that Sudanese know full well, and I have this slide for those who are not from Sudan or maybe not as familiar, to talk about the four legacies that help us explain the war and its dynamics from the previous regime. Number one is a pillar. These are four pillars. The first pillar is what I call state predation. This is a policy of temkin or empowerment, as Hassan Turabi here coined. And the idea was, number one, the state, that the Islamist regime at the time would utilize the state in order to, generate rents and allocate those rents to those loyal to his movement and organization. The second aspect was to transform the bureaucracy in Sudan. There's a great deal of discussion and debate about the relationship to the Islamist movement and the present leadership of the Sudan Armed Forces. We can certainly talk about that. That's one of the most important topics of debate among Sudanese, and it becomes, and of course, internationally, recently, the United States decided to designate the Muslim Brotherhood of Sudan as a terrorist organization. And so it's very important to understand the legacies of these kind of debates. One of them was to basically evict, purge, fire, and oftentimes imprison non-loyalists from the bureaucracy. In the early 1990s, approximately 600,000 Sudanese bureaucrats and civil servants were expelled and replaced with Islamist loyalists. Another aspect, as I mentioned, was to dominate the local economy. And they did that, and that's what my previous book is about, by monopolizing financial informal markets through the banking systems to help to build a very important financial base for the military and for those allied with them in the civil service. But perhaps the one I want you to keep in mind in order to understand the direct dynamics of this to the war is the coup-proofing that the regime of Umar Bashir implemented, and that was to develop a parallel coercive apparatus. This apparatus basically multiplied the militias and security forces, ranging from the Popular Defense Forces to the National Intelligence and Security Service to the Janjaweed in Darfur, and of course that later became in 2013 the Rapid Support Forces led by Dugalo. Why was this implemented by the regime at the time? I would say that one of the reasons for it, and one of the main reasons, is Sudanese historically have fought very hard for civilian democracy, beginning in the 1950s and even before. It's also a country that has witnessed the most coup attempts in the African continent, 6 or more since independence. And so the Bashir regime, learning from the past, wanted to diminish the power of the National Standing Army in order not to have military coups against them, an ingenious way of coup-proofing the regime, and also to expand the militia forces like the Rapid Support Forces to do two things: to put down the insurgencies like those in Darfur, and to stop the will of the Sudanese people from actually going on the street for waging an intifada, as they did in 2018, to call for a civilian democratic transition. And so this makes sense of these four pillars of Tamkeen during that period. What really brought all of this edifice down was something that I always like to mention, because I think we forget that this war is directly related to the wonderful, I would say, normatively and subjectively, the popular will of the Sudanese people that led to this huge revolution that many of you saw and heard about in late 2018 that went on until really the coup of 2021 in Sudan. And that was a result of the context of the economic crisis following the secession of South Sudan in 2011. The Bashir regime basically was strapped for cash. They lost a majority oil revenue that represented 90% of the economy. And they also lost their historical constituency in the riverine areas, particularly in the northern part of Sudan, where many of the leadership of the Sudanese armed forces came from. Another aspect was the loss of support, and here external actors really matter. The Arab and Gulf countries began to withdraw their support financially from the regime. It began very early on as Sudan supported the Saddam Hussein and later on other aspects with respect to their relationship to Qatar as one example. But what's really important, and I'm going to show just one slide that talks about and maybe explains why this revolution was so successful at the time, why it really brought down the regime of Umar Bashir, or rather his leadership. And I like to show this nifty kind of illustration to give you an idea of why it did succeed at the time. Number one, the depth of the economic crisis led to, as Dr. Saad and others will know, not only the bankruptcy of the regime itself, but Sudanese really were not able to pay even the modicum of economic kind of and social kind of needs. There wasn't even any way to get cash from even the banks at the time. So you had a collective grievances I put here, but what was really important was the new mobilization structures that I call them, the resistance committees, those who protest in the streets, but also the emergence of the Sudanese Professional Association. This was a coalition of professional associations that coordinated the different steps of the revolution, helping also to frame to Sudanese why it was so imperative to bring down this corrupt regime. Taken together, this was an ingenious kind of coming together of both street protesters, middle class Sudanese, and of course also upper class Sudanese, who were all joined together to overthrow this regime, calling for a civilian democracy. That was made possible by the international support, the African Union in particular. Um, this led to a very fragile transitional government. And this is something that I wanted to emphasize very quickly because it fell apart primarily from the very beginning because of an agreement that was very, very fragile. It brought in civilian leadership and military leadership, but there was no real implementation and institutionalization of a parliament that would really represent the will of the Sudanese people who waged the revolution. From the very beginning, it's easy to see this in retrospect. The military officers had very much wanted basically to reform the regime, but not to oversee the country to a civilian democracy. But it was in 2020 that we saw really the upending of this revolution through a Juba agreement that was brokered by the military leadership and civilian leadership that brought in insurgent organizations to the Sovereign Council, this fragile governmental structure, basically increasing by 25% representations of people who are military and not civilian. This really tipped the balance towards the military and gave a great deal of incentive for the leadership of the Sudan Armed Forces to begin essentially to plot against the revolution and to consolidate military power once again. There were lots of elements that were really problematic, but the one I want to emphasize is that Sudanese had wanted the implementation of a legislative assembly that was delayed, and Burhan, the leader at the time, also refused to rotate out of his presidency of that partnership for Hamdok, the prime minister at the time. And so what happened is that these insurgent organizations represented spoilers. They were challenged by the armed opposition organized around the Sudan Revolutionary Forces, and so these really represent domestic spoilers that sided eventually with the military against the civilians, and they continued to fight on the side of Sudan Armed Forces. So the Juba Agreement, unfortunately, where it was supposed to promise peace and reconciliation, basically represented spoilers that undermined the civilian transition. But it was in 2021, after the protests continued for democracy, it was easier for me to show you the slide, that a coup occurred that essentially upended the revolution. It was at in this year that many Sudanese begin to understand that a war was probably coming. Despite all efforts on the part of Sudanese civilians and protesters to try to pressure Burhan and Hemeti, who was his partner at the time, time to return to a civilian democratic transition, he decided, or they decided, it's important to say, in partnership, to implement a coup against the people of Sudan and that democracy. They dissolved the constitutional document, detained and arrested the resistance committee members. They released members of the former regime, the Islamist stalwarts that I mentioned, and they did something that also was extremely important and consequential. They dissolved what was called at the time the empowerment, the empowerment committee that was designed under the revolution to really go after the corrupt assets of the previous regime and try to basically dismantle the financial assets of the regime at the time in order to oversee the country to a more robust, healthier, and non-corrupt or less corrupt, political dispensation. So the catalyst of the war, number one, was this military coup. But I would argue that it was also this dismantling of the deep state. It's important to highlight that following the coup, Sudanese begin and continue to protest all the way up to the late 2022. And there were two contentious issues that many of you, or some of you may be aware, that led to the war. One was a disagreement under the framework agreement that pushed these parties once again to talk to the civilian leadership and political parties to merge the rapid support forces into the National Standing Army. This was an important disagreement, a very, very hot, contentious issue. And here is where Burhan, the head of Sudan Armed Forces, and Hemeti or Dagalo of the Rapid Support Forces disagreed. Burhan wanted it to happen within the course of maybe 2 or 3 years. Dagalo said 10 years. That was an important catalyst of contention or for the war. But the second one I want to emphasize was they also were very, very concerned about this Temkin Removal Committee or the Empowerment Removal Committee that was going to dismantle their financial assets, both of them, not just one. The Sudan Armed Forces leadership had, in partnership with the Rapid Support Forces, built a whole edifice of financial wealth from oil and from gold. In fact, it was the Sudan Armed Forces leadership that first gave the gold concessions in the West and in other parts of Sudan to Hemeti to develop and expand his militia. So this second contentious point is very important. It is one that Professor Souad is nodding her head because recently what is happening, it's being revived by Sudanese in order to once again go over their assets abroad. And so that aspect, taken together with this issue of security sector reform, catalyzed the war that began in April 15th, 2023. The catalyst for it tactically was a skirmish between the Rapid Support Forces and the military. We now know that that was orchestrated to begin the war, and it expanded, as I mentioned, through the capital and elsewhere. I want to conclude because I tend to, when I talk about Sudan, I can go on for hours and hours, but I want to conclude about neighboring states and then very quickly spoils. The neighboring states that I mentioned earlier are very important. Sudan has a historically very important relationship with the Gulf countries. In fact, Bab el-Mandeb in the Arabic, as many of you know from your department, is translated as the Gate of Lamentation. In Arabic folklore, that is a lamentation, and Arabs very much are prone to lamentation and melancholy. But it marks this notion that there was this historic split between the Horn of Africa and countries like Sudan from their Arab kin in the Arab Gulf region. The historical ties are immense, but also so are their economic ties. And here you'll just see very quickly the level of investment of the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, but also in previous decades, Kuwait, over the agricultural kind of heartland of many part of Sudan. And there's a reason why that's the case. It's mostly about food sufficiency and security in the Gulf, but also as Gulf countries begin to envision a transition, energy transition to diversifying their economies. Sudan plays not a peripheral, but a very important part in the strategization and the future outlook and visions of the Gulf countries themselves. So the valuable commodities here become important. Gold is extremely important, as I mentioned. And the reason it is, it's number one, because Sudan is the third largest exporter in Africa. But it's also important because it also represents the revenue generation or source for the rapid support forces, as you can see here in the West, but also for the Sudan armed forces. And I show you this map to show you that both parties profit from gold. The reason it's profitable is 90% of it is smuggled informally outside of the border. It doesn't fall into the hands of the state, but rather into the militias and paramilitary groups that are funded by the Sudan Armed Forces as well. This war economy, fueled by gold, is one of the reasons we see such a kind of great sustainability and the expansion of the war economy. I want to conclude with something that is perhaps related to the logic of political violence quickly. And then, if you don't mind, Professor, I want to try to conclude with a more hopeful conclusion. But one that I think is important because it's very important for people to understand that what is happening in Sudan in terms of violence is not a normal state of affairs. I say this because recently in the Atlantic there was a very big article in the United States that talked about the war in Sudan essentially about nothing. Unfortunately, it's not about nothing. It's about almost everything. It's not a normal state of affairs for Sudan or any other country, nor is the violence something that is common in the context of Sudan outside war. And so it's very important to understand why the violence occurs the way it does. And here we can learn from other wars. It is on the part of both the Sudan Armed Forces leadership and particularly the Rapid Support Forces, basically weapons of the weak. Violence here is a form of coercive consent. Why do I make this point? Is because from the beginning of the war, when I've been giving many, many interviews from global outlets, including the United States, I always emphasized, and we all do, that this is a war against the Sudanese population because the majority of Sudanese, 99%, are completely opposed to both parties. Let me repeat that because I think people get it confounded. Both Sudanese in the majority are, for the history I described, are opposed and refuse to give consent, legitimate consent, to these different parties. And the reason that that is important is because it has led to a strategy of violence on the part of the Rapid Support Forces and paramilitary militias linked to the Sudan Armed Forces. The reason for that is that in order to generate legitimacy, each leader must provide and administer justice, collect taxes, and even provide public goods. If you see the rhetoric on both sides, you'll be surprised to see and read and hear from their speeches that they are perennially interested in saying that they are there to safeguard the revolution. They are there to provide public goods. They are there to oversee the secondary school examinations. One side, the Sudan Armed Forces says that Sudan will be in our image. La Sudan dunana. There will be no Sudan without us. Rapid Support Forces leader Dagalo says that he is remarkably going to provide ethnic and racial equality all of a sudden. And so in order to generate consent, because no one really believes this rhetoric and propaganda, they are both in pursuit of punishing those who do not side with them. And the one way to do that, unfortunately, is through collective violence. This is a very important and sad point. And the reason the violence has increased and increased is because among Sudanese communities in Darfur and elsewhere, if you read very closely, no one is giving their consent. No one is giving legitimacy to these parties. That fragmentation has led, believe it or not, to even more desperation on the part of the warring parties. It's because the Rapid Support Forces is weak in legitimacy that it's implementing this scale of violence, not because it's powerful. So it's very important to really emphasize what we mean by political legitimacy and what its role in this kind of violence. It leads to the escalation of violence, and what it does, it forces, at least from the perspective of these leaders, forces civilians in Darfur, in Kordofan, now in Kurmuk around the Blue Nile area, around Khartoum and elsewhere, even in Port Sudan to the east, to calculate that their survival is the only thing they have left. And so that is a calculation that the leadership has. I'm not talking about the individuals themselves. It's difficult to analyze this kind of violence individually. There's no question at the leadership level, there is a strategy where violence is used in order to, through coercion, manufacture, generate, and force consent among Sudanese population that refuse to give legitimacy to this war. And finally, I want to emphasize why I think that there is, we have to look forward in terms of peace and resolution. There are many reasons why, and I think I outlined them at the beginning. We have to calculate the role and interest of the regional parties to understand the environment, which requires understanding the roots of the conflicts and the dynamics of it. I hope that by looking at spoilers, by looking at the environment of the war and the geography of Sudan, but also the resources, that I help to explain to you some of the roots and dynamics. But when we look at resolving the conflict, it's very important to understand that security sector reform is very important. And the reason I mention this, because if you read the statements of the Quad or the Quartet or the Jeddah talks, you will see that there is an emphasis on a ceasefire and humanitarian access, which is important. But there is no emphasis on the most important pillar that we know actually stops violence and leads to a sustainable peace. And that is demobilization and demilitarization. It's security sector reform. After all, this war essentially began because of a failure of security sector reform. Yet, we don't see the external actors really talking about it in concrete ways. Why is that important? Because this kind of demobilization, it ceases violence, at least between the excuse me, the warring parties, and it provides a political alternative. It provides, as one scholar put it, an alternative to life without the gun. And that becomes really, really important. In order to provide a peace, it has to provide alternatives. As Stephen Stedman, who was a professor of mine years ago, taught us, and he's one of the major experts on how civil wars end. As he put it, without achieving this critical goal, civil wars cannot be brought to an end, and important normative goals, such as the creation of democracy and the protection of human rights, have little chance of success. How is that related to peace agreements? In addition to this, the best brokers that can implement this are Sudanese civil society. Not because it's politically correct to say bring in civilians, but because we know from the examples of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, that civil society in the context of war actually sets the agenda for peace talks and ceasefire and helps to implement it and has the legitimacy in local communities to sustain the peace. I am going to conclude, this is my final slide, by giving you the words, not of myself, but of the Elders and Mediation Committee in El Fashir. I want to conclude, after giving you this political science framing, to take the words of our own people in Darfur. And many of you know the devastation that happened in Darfur and the siege and the violence that happened last October. But recently, last week, I was on a panel with a good, close Sudanese friend from Darfur, and I'm not going to say Darfurian, I'm going to say a close Sudanese friend from Darfur, who once again reinforced and explained to me that Al-Fashir did not fall and was so strong all of this time because of the mediation of local authorities, who, in their own words, insisted on peace based on framing the war properly, protection and protecting civilians, and monitoring the peace. They insisted in their documentation, meeting with the different clans of Darfur, that the war has to be defined as a conflict between the Sudan Armed Forces and the RSF, not between the Sudanese people. They rejected the category of a civil war because they believe that that is instrumentalized by the warring parties. The second thing that they insisted was key to implementing a peace is protecting civilians irrespective of their ethnic, political, or ideological affiliation. And that could only be done by legitimate authorities across the different ethnic groups in Darfur. The monitoring had to be set up by subcommittees that would monitor the ceasefire and shield civilians from violations. These are not my words. They're not from Stephen Stedman. These are the words from the elders of the Mediation Committee in El Fashil, the EMC. So I want to conclude there, and I'm very happy to have a discussion. I know Professor Souad has much more to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Khalid Medani, for this very insightful talk and presentation. And before I open it, up for discussion, I'd like to acknowledge the presence and welcome ASU distinguished Professor Michael Sachs from the School of Law and the Department of Psychology, as well as other colleagues, Dr. Sarah Risha, Dr. Faraj Hamdan, Dr. Ni'ma Musa, and all of our guests and faculty and students. Welcome very much indeed. So I'm going to open it up for discussion in a minute. Dr. Khalid, if we look at the modern history of Sudan, you spoke about the 1956 state. And that's, marking the independence of Sudan from British and Egyptian colonialism. And we see, very clearly that before the Sudan, as history tells us, organized its house as a civilian country after colonialism and as independent country, the first military coup took place in 1958. 2 years only later, General Aboud, who staged a military coup that lasted for 6 years. There was a very popular October 21st, 1964 revolution that Sudanese people single-handedly toppled that dictatorship. And there was a transitional government and free election, in 1965. But unfortunately, after each of these civilian democratic government, another military coup took place. Now, the second one was Nimeri's 1969, May 25th of 1969, that Nimeri, toppled that government, democratic government, and stayed in power for 16 years as a military dictatorship. And then, of course, we have the one that we witness, as undergraduate students, because usually these, revolutions, they are mainly supported by the students. They take to the streets, and 1985, there was the April 6th, 1985 revolution. And again, Sudanese people, the Sha'ab Sudani, the Sudanese people, single-handedly, without any military foreign intervention, toppled those dictatorship. And so in the 1986 election, after the transitional government, again, we have election, and the government stayed only for 3 years, a civilian democracy. Then Omar al-Bashir, that you talked extensively about, staged its military coup on June 30th of 1989. Now, unfortunately, each of these dictatorships was supported by a civilian political party, despite the fact that the Sudan used to have a very well-established political party, and but they supported or instigated some of these military dictatorships. Of course, Omar al-Bashir was supported by the Islamists, and Nimeri was supported by the communists, and the communists themselves tried in 1971, but they couldn't make it, and they stayed only for 3 days, and so on. So unfortunately, the weakness of of the civil society and the weakness of civil political party, I personally think it's the main reason why these military dictatorships, they are not justified to come, but they just, invested in the failure of the civil political party and civil apparatus. And at this point now, the last revolution that you talked about, which is December 2018, January 2019, that toppled Omar al-Bashir, who stayed for 30 long years, supported by the Islamists. It was a huge revolution, acknowledged by the entire world. And then again, Al-Burhan toppled that, revolution by the coup that occurred on October 25th of 2021, that as you mentioned. So, this is just a comment, that I just wanted to trace this history of the fact that the Sudan, that is a country that, described by the United Nations as the basket food of the world, سلة غذاء العالم, and with all of the resources, the oil and gold and minerals and everything, we still have it as now a very poor country because of these wars. But again, especially, of course, the war in the south, of course, first before the independence of South Sudan, and now this very ugly war that is happening in Darfur and in Khartoum and also in other parts of the world. So we look forward to, as we continue, both you and I, our research. And of course, now I have been invited by Cambridge University Press, that I invited you to be my co-editor, and Dr. Gharib Sharaf, on the Cambridge Companion for Sudan Civil War. We're working on that, and hopefully this will come in about 3 years. So with just this comment, I'd like to open it up for our guests and faculty and students who would like to ask questions. Please either show a hand or just unmute yourself and go ahead.
I just want to say thank you so very much. I learned so many things, and this is really, the news, they don't cover a lot. So thank you so very, very much.
You are most welcome. Dr. Sarah Risha.
Dr. Khalid,
Dr.
thank
Faraj
you.
Hamdan.
Thank you very much for this lecture. I wish peace for Sudan and for all other countries and nations. I have like 2 questions. One, did you think the war of the Middle East right now between like America, Israel, and Iran, it will affect the Sudan case? Because we know a lot of Gulf countries like Saudi, Emirates, involved in this in one way or other. And the second question is, I know maybe this is like proud and it is like it's complicated question, but just like in short, what is the future of Sudan and what are the future perspective of the conflict in country? So just in your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Khalid.
Yes. Well, Dr. Arisha, you're more than welcome. It's such an honor for you to come listen to this talk. Ustaz Hamdan, thank you for your question. I may have to ask you to repeat the second one, but the first one, yeah, could you repeat the second one?
Yeah, the second one is, what is the future of Sudan and what are the future prospect of the conflict in the country?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Just in short, I know this is maybe take another lecture.
What is the future of Sudan? Yes. أنا مش ساحر يا أستاذ. استغفر الله. I think the first question we can have a discussion together. I'm on many panels. I'm an editor of the I know you guys are familiar with IJMIS, the International Journal for Middle East Studies, and we talk, all of us, about the different countries in the region. And the one thing that I tell everyone is that we can no longer afford just to study one country in the region. So you can answer this question probably yourself in terms of the war in Iran, and that is that the entire region is being affected by all the other countries. The other day, I said you can't understand Sudan without understanding what's going on in Yemen. And then a week later, Saudi Arabia and the UAE were fighting in Yemen again. So we have to really understand that it's very analytically important to understand that. So in the case of the Iran war, I showed you the financial and humanitarian consequences of both the Strait of Hormuz, but you have to understand Bab el-Mandeb also is under siege essentially, and also the receipts for Egypt are really have decreased a great deal, right? The insecurity, and now of course we know at any moment there could be a form of closure, but it's happening. Bab el-Mandeb is witnessing what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz as well, because it's not about full closure, it's about insecurity that's affecting the economy. On another geopolitical aspect, it is no secret to really, and I've outlined, I'll give you an example. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and the UAE is pivotal. We all know there's fierce competition. A few days ago, the UAE left OPEC. For people not to understand that this affects Sudan, it doesn't make any sense. The Red Sea is very, very important. The UAE essentially supports the Rapid Support Forces, and the Saudi Arabia supports the Sudan Armed Forces. The reason is quite also very much part of their relationship to the entire region. The UAE, Saudi Arabia is privileging stability. I'm not talking about democracy versus non-democracy, stability in the region. The UAE finds a comparative advantage in a very different kind of vision. A vision of isolating different countries from each other, but also partnering now with Israel more, and also monopolizing the ports. So Sudan has a direct relationship to these countries. Having said that, I think it's good for everyone. We may disagree that there must be a peace and stability within the Gulf itself. And people are pushing for that now. For example, in Oman, they're pushing for that. So the stability and reconciliation of the Gulf countries in the context of the war and Iran will pay dividends for Sudan. Now, Sudan is hurting, but so are the Gulf countries. And so are all of the countries in the region. We have to really put all of it together and start thinking about a comprehensive resolution to what is happening in the region. And the only way we can do that is to have conversations that includes all of the vested actors. And that's happening even in Berlin, the first step. If you see the roster of people there, it's Egypt, Saudi Arabia. The only missing country is the UAE. The Arab League is there, the African Union is there, IGAD is there. A recognition, as I said at the beginning, of how this war is an international regional war, or rather a regional war. In terms of the future of Sudan in general, I am very fortunate to have spent many years studying African civil wars. And I'm fortunate to be able to speak about the Middle East, but also about Africa. These are two different regions historically in the political sense, in the sense that most of the African countries are run by democratic constitutions. And they, in that part of it, is something Sudan really I believe, can follow, including the supporting civil society, a transition to democracy. And if you look at the African experiments with democracy, they have taken a long time. Professor Souad has mentioned the different kind of interrupted democratic experiments in Sudan. Those are very similar to Kenya. You know, when you look at Kenya from the 90s to the present, you'll see over time it developed stronger political parties, more autonomous from the military, stronger rule of law and institutions for democracy, electoral commission that we've never had in Sudan. So Professor Souad mentioned something very important. Sudanese blame the political parties also for their alliance with the military. But all of these transitions were very short. In the last revolution, Sudanese people were saying, we want a long transition. We have to have autonomous political parties. We need a parliament. We need an electoral institution. And we need to promote a political culture of democracy. That is what African countries have done. Finally, I want to say it's important, and I say this very frankly, whether it is to Egyptian friends, Saudis, I'm talking to academics and politicians, and that is that you have to understand that democracy will bring stability to Sudan. Sudan is different in many instances. It's very ethnically diverse. It has different kind of histories, and so it democracy for Sudan will not bring instability or threats to the region. It'll do what other African countries have done, and I think it would stabilize it. So that I believe is the future of Sudan.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Anybody else would like to have a question or a comment?
Hello.
Yeah, Muhammad, تفضل.
شكرا.
Go
Assalamu
ahead.
alaikum,
عليكم السلام.
Dr. Khalid.
Alaikum assalam.
I found your presentation very intriguing and interesting and very informative. I had one question regarding
Could
one
you
of the
introduce yourself,
solutions.
Muhammad? إذا ما عندك مانع يعني.
Huh?
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Muhammad Imam. I'm living in Qatar right now, from Sudan.
Okay.
So I'm in Professor Souad's class.
أهلا
Yes.
وسهلا. Yes, I bet you
Thank
know
you.
our other friend in Qatar.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, my question was related to one of the solutions that you pointed out for the civil war, as they call it, about the demilitarization of the military. And I wanted to ask what incentives would there need to be for them to actually want to demilitarize, and how likely would it be for them to for that to actually happen?
Well, thank you, Mohammed. That's such an important question. It's, we have to, and this is why I'm glad that you're taking Professor Saad's course. This is one of the strange advantages of academics or, policy analyst, and that is that we can look in a comparative sense. All wars in Africa have the majority. There are two ways wars end, as you probably can imagine very intuitively. Either one party generates a military victory and wins, but the majority of wars since World War II have actually, and you can read on this in terms of conflict resolution and civil wars, all of the literature, you'll see with very little exception, almost all of them end up ending through a negotiated settlement. That happened even with South Sudan, although it led to a separation. So in the case of Sudan, their incentive, I think that's your direct question, is really what we call, and William Zartman and others called a mutually hurting stalemate. I know that both sides are saying that, they are on the kind of cusp of victory, but that is said in all of these kind of brutal wars. A mutually hurting stalemate takes some time. It leads to exhaustion, and it leads to all forms of compromise in the end. Now, that is what we know from history and from other African countries. The role of external actors and how coherent they are in pressuring both parties is very, very important. And it is difficult for those who are disillusioned by external actors and regional actors to conceive of negotiations among these actors that could potentially bring a war to an end. But I think that we are seeing movement towards that. And I would really encourage you to look very seriously at the beginning of the Jeddah US Saudi Arabian talks, all the way through the one in Bahrain, and then Switzerland, and then the Americans. And you'll see movement, and you'll see different kind of negotiations. And I think you probably know, Mohammed, that there is no such thing as not talking to anyone. Both parties are talking behind the scenes to all of these countries. And so I think that the mutually hurting stalemate that continues, and the pressure eventually on the part of the international community that sees this as undermining their own interest, gradually brings people to the negotiation table. And we've seen this even in South Sudan. I'm older than you, and I knew John Garang. At that time, people said this war will never end. I am not going to predict the outcome, whether it will lead to a civilian democracy or some kind of de facto separation. But I will tell you that what we know is that negotiations always happen in the end.
Thank you
Thank you.
very much indeed. Thank you, Muhammad. Muhammad is taking my Arabic, Islamic culture and literature class. That is an online class, an I course, an online class, which opens, opportunities for students from around the world, to take classes. The ASU online, program is a very strong program, and Muhammad is talking from Doha, Qatar. Thank you very much indeed. Anybody else would like, please just unmute yourself, and if you have a question or a comment, or you can write it down in chat if you'd like to do that as well. Until we have somebody who, who'd like to ask the question again. Dr. Khalid, you spoke about the role of women. I just, finished writing an article about the role of women in the success of the 2018-19 revolution. And women in Sudan played a significant role in all of these, revolutions, especially the very last one. And this has been acknowledged very widely. And unfortunately, the revolution, was toppled by the military as well. And but women are still extensively working, and we're all members of many groups of women, whether in the diaspora or inside the country. And despite the dictatorship that is, affecting them so negatively, of course, in their roles. And so I wanted you to expand on that part that you spoke briefly about the role of women.
Sure. Yes. Well, I think that you're probably more expert than I am, but I want to. There may be two things. One of them, there's always maybe a surprise that women were so active in this revolution, and because people are not familiar with Sudan, as they saw Ala, of course, and the wonderful
Yes.
representation of Sudanese women. But I think that people really are not aware that Sudanese women, as you know, this activism begins very early on during the colonial period. And people like Fatma Ibrahim becomes one of the first parliamentarians, if not the first in the Arab world and Africa. And many different Sudanese organizations and NGOs become very important. But one of the things that I didn't mention in the pillars or Temkeen, in addition to long-standing organizations from the different political parties that set the stage for Sudanese feminism, both secular, socialist, and Islamist feminism as well, put together, I think that what made the revolution different was the public morality law. I think that what people, didn't always keep in mind is that prior to the revolution, there was a draconian implementation of, public shaming and violence against Sudanese women. We all know relatives that went through it, and I don't think we don't know any Sudanese family that hasn't experienced that kind of public shaming, public violence. And so that was very important. When I interviewed Sudanese women activists at the time, they said that they were really tired of being, quote unquote, unfree in the public sphere. And so the history of Sudanese women organization and the history of a state policy against women in this non-Sudanese, non-Muslim way and non-compassionate way, I think, and their restriction in the public sphere, all of those in my interviews with Sudanese women, and there's Samia Nagar and others feminists who have written about it. My aunt has written about it a lot, so that's why I know these things. So that really brought everything together. Now, the other thing I want to say is that women play a very important role in conflict resolution. Recently, I forgot his name, the head of the OCHA, who left
Yes.
the UN, has a very nice report. I think it's in his book. I have to check it, but I would recommend people looking at it. And he emphasized why women were so central to conflict resolution beyond cosmetic representation. You have to remember, without women in Liberia, there would have been no peace. So Liberian women really were central. The same goes, and he explains and explains to people why women, as part of conflict resolution negotiations, are so important. Number one is that they show less bias politically, ideologically, and racially, and they have less investment politically and economically. And so they represent arbiters, non-biased kind of bloc. They may have political parties, but they are very much less aligned to those motivations. So there's a lot of theorizing and work that's been done to show it's not like if you like women or not, but if you hate, of course, everyone should. What I mean is that it's not cosmetic. It really is women play a central role in implementing peace agreements. And that's really important to emphasize.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Khalid. And as we come close to the end of this very interesting, insightful talk, I'd like to thank you very much indeed again, and thank all of our, faculty and students, and again, Professor Michael Sachs is the Regent Professor in the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Art and Law, College of Law, and at Department of Psychology, and our faculty from the Arabic Studies program in Silk and in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Dr. Faraj Hamdan, Dr. Ni'ma Musa, Dr. Sarah Risha, and everybody else, all of the other faculty and students. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to welcome you all again and invite you and remind you of our other activities. This is our second lecture series for this semester. We have two lectures in the lecture series every semester. The first one was Dr. Asma Barras from Ithaca College and Dr. Khalid Medani from McGill University. And we have prepared more lectures coming in the fall, of course, and we have our film series and different initiatives and upcoming conferences. So please follow our website for that. And thank you all very much indeed. Thank you, Prachi, my assistant, and for the recording this lecture as well, and for our assistant. Thank you very much indeed.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Appreciate it.
مع السلامة.
Assalamu.